Chapter 5. The Appropriate Tools. Perhaps the best measure of the ways that 3 centuries of cheap, abundant energy have shaped modern thinking is the forceful resistance so many of us put up to thinking about technology in economic terms. It should be obvious that whether or not a given technology continues to exist in a time of faltering abundance depends on 3 economic factors. The first is whether the things done by that technology are necessities or luxuries, and if they are necessities, just how necessary they are. The second is whether the same things, or at least the portion of them that must be done, can be done by another technology at a lower cost in scarce resources. The third is how the benefits gained by keeping the technology supplied with the scarce resources it needs measure up to the benefits gained by putting those same resources to other uses. To most people nowadays, though, these points are anything but obvious. To accept that economic factors might lead societies to discard technologies in an age of contraction flies in the face of some of the most pervasive habits of modern thought. To a remarkable extent, belief in technological progress has taken on a religious value in the modern world, especially but not only among those who reject every other kind of religious thinking. The faith in progress has drawn strength from the unquestionable fact that for the last 3 centuries those who believed in the possibilities of progress have generally been right. There have been some stunning failures, to be sure, but the trajectory that reached its climax with human footprints on the moon makes a potent argument for the claim that technological complexity is cumulative, irreversible, and immune to economic concerns. Still, it's a mistake to take the experience of an exceptional epoch in human history as a law governing that history as a whole. In the final analysis, the 3 centuries of exponential growth that put those boot prints on the gray dust of the Sea of Tranquility were made possible by the conjunction of historical accidents and geological laws that allowed a handful of nations to seize the fantastic treasure of fossil carbon buried in the earth and burn through it at an extravagant rate, flooding their economies with almost unimaginable amounts of cheap, concentrated energy. It's been fashionable to assume that the arc of progress was what made all that energy available, but there's very good reason to think that this puts the cart in front of the horse. A few technical advances were necessary to break into the Earth's carbon storehouse, but it was the huge surpluses of available energy thus released that made the following age of technological progress possible, as inventors, industrialists, and ordinary people all discovered that it was cheaper to have machines powered by fossil fuels take over jobs that had been done for millennia by human and animal muscles, fueled by solar energy in the form of food. The logic of abundance that was made plausible as well as possible by those surpluses has had limits on our society that very few people have begun yet to confront. Many of the most basic ways that modern industrial nations use energy, for example, make sense only if energy is so cheap and abundant that waste simply isn't something to worry about. Consider the system of electrical generation and distribution that provides most of the energy modern people use outside of transportation. The inefficiencies of electrical generation and distribution are such that less than 1/3 of the energy contained in the fuel that is burnt in power plants actually reaches the end user. The rest becomes waste heat at various stages in the process. For the sake of having electricity instantly available from sockets on nearly every wall in the industrial world, in other words, we accept unthinkingly a system that requires us to burn more than 3 times as much energy as we actually use. In a world where concentrated energy sources are scarce and expensive, many extravagances of this kind will stop being possible, and most of them will stop being economically feasible as well. In a certain sense, this is a good thing, because thinking along these lines suggests many ways in which nations facing an energy crisis can cut their losses and maintain vital systems. It's been pointed out repeatedly, for example, that the electrical grids that supply power to homes and businesses across the industrial world may stop being viable early on in the process of contraction, and some peak oil thinkers have accordingly drawn up nightmare scenarios around the sudden and irreversible collapse of national power grids. Like most doomsday scenarios, though, these rest on the unstated and unexamined assumption that everybody involved will sit on their hands and take no action as the collapse unfolds. This assumption rests in turn on the very widespread unwillingness to think through the consequences of an age of contracting energy supplies. The managers of a power grid facing collapse due to a shortage of generation capacity have one obvious alternative to hand: cutting non-essential sectors out of the grid, so the load on the grid decreases to a level that the available generation capacity can handle. In an emergency, for example, many American suburbs and a large part of the country's non-agricultural rural land could have electrical service shut off completely, and an even larger portion of both could be put on the kind of intermittent electrical service common in the Third World without catastrophic results. Of course, there would be an economic impact, but it would be modest compared to letting the whole grid crash. Over the longer term, just as the 20th century was the era of rural electrification, the 21st promises to be the era of rural de-electrification. A nation facing prolonged or permanent shortages of electrical generating capacity could make its available power go further by cutting its rural hinterlands off the power grid and leaving them to generate whatever power they can by local means. Less than a century ago, most farmhouses on North America's Great Plains had a windmill nearby, generating 12 or 24 volts for home use whenever the wind blew. The same approach would be just as viable in the future, not least because windmills on the home scale, unlike the huge turbines central to most current notions of wind power, can be built by hand from readily available materials. Skeptics take note. I helped build one in college in the early 1980s, using, among other things, an old truck alternator and a propeller hand-carved from wood. Yes, it worked. Steps like this have seen very little discussion in recent years because the assumptions about technology that unfold from the faith in progress make them unthinkable. Most people in the industrial world today seem to have lost the ability to imagine a future that doesn't have electricity coming out of a socket in every wall without going to the other extreme and leaning on Hollywood cliches of universal destruction. The idea that some of the most familiar technologies of today may simply become too expensive and inefficient to maintain tomorrow is alien to ways of thought dominated by the logic of abundance. That blindness, however, comes with a huge price tag. As the age of abundance made possible by fossil fuels comes to its inevitable end, a great many things could be done to cushion the impact. Quite a few of these could be done by individuals, families, and local communities. To continue with the example under discussion, it would not be that hard for people who live in rural areas or suburbs to provide themselves with backup systems using local renewable energy to keep their homes viable in the event of a prolonged or permanent electrical outage. None of the steps involved are hugely expensive. Most of them have immediate payback in the form of lower energy bills, and local and national governments in much of the industrial world are currently offering financial incentives, some of them very robust, to those who pursue them. Despite this, most of the attention and effort that goes into responses to a future of energy constraints focuses on finding new ways to put power into the existing electrical grid without ever asking whether this will be a viable response in an age when the extravagance of the present day is no longer an option. This is why attention to economics in a world on the cusp of peak oil is so crucial. Could an electric grid of the sort we have today, with its centralized power plants and a vast network of wires bringing power to sockets on every wall, remain a feature of life throughout the industrial world in an energy-constrained future? If attempts to make sense of that future assume that this will happen as a matter of course, or start with the unexamined assumption that such a grid is at best or only possible way to provide energy to consumers, the resulting discussions will fixate on technical debates about whether and how that can be made to happen, while the core issues that need to be examined slip out of sight. One question that has to be asked instead is whether a power grid of the sort we take for granted will be economically viable in such a future. That is, whether such a grid is as necessary as it seems to us today. whether the benefits of having it will cover the costs of maintaining and operating it, and whether the scarce resources it uses could produce a better return if put to work in some other way. Local conditions might provide any number of answers to that question. In some countries and regions, where people live close together and renewable energy sources such as hydroelectric power promise a stable supply of electricity for the relatively long term, a national or regional grid of the current type may prove viable. In others, it might be much more viable to have restricted power grids supplying urban areas and critical infrastructure, while rural hinterlands return to locally generated power or to non-electrified lifestyles. In still others, a power grid of any kind might prove to be economically impossible. Under all these conditions, even the first, it makes sense for governments to encourage citizens and businesses to provide as much of their own energy needs as possible from locally available, diffuse energy sources such as sunlight and wind, and to pursue conservation and efficiency measures much further than they have been pursued to date. Under all these conditions, in turn, it makes at least as much sense for individuals, families, and communities to take such steps themselves, so that any interruption in electrical power from the grid, temporary or permanent, becomes an inconvenience rather than a threat to survival. A case can be made that in the face of a future of uncertain energy supplies, off-grid sources of space heating, hot water, and other basic necessities here are as important in a modern city, suburb, or rural area as life jackets are in a boat. Individuals and groups who hope to foster local resilience in the face of such a future probably ought to make such simple and readily available technologies as solar water heating, solar space heating, home-scale wind power, and the like central themes in their planning. Up till now, this has rarely happened, and the hold of the logic of abundance on our collective imagination is a good part of the reason why. The electrical power grid is only one example of a system that only makes sense in a world where energy is so abundant that even huge inefficiencies don't matter. It's hardly difficult to think of others. To think in these terms, though, and to begin to explore more economically viable options for meeting individual and community needs in an age of scarce energy, is to venture into a nearly unexplored region where most of the rules that govern contemporary economic life are turned on their heads. The end of the information age. Probably the best example is the looming impact of a future of energy constraints on the ways that modern industrial nations store, process, and distribute information. Few subjects have been loaded with as much hype as this one. Our era, the media never tires of repeating, is the information age. Economic sectors dealing with mere material goods and services have been regulated to third-world sweatshops, while the economic cutting edge deals entirely in the manufacture, sales, and service of information in various forms. As usual, can you think of a short-term trend that hasn't been identified as a wave of the future, destined to rise up an exponential curve to infinity, or at least absurdity? I can't. The assumption is that the future will be just like the present, but more so, with more elaborate technologies providing more baroque information products and services as far as the eye, or the webcam, can see. This is hardly a new vision of the future. In his 1909 novella, The Machine Stops, E.M. Forrester provided a remarkably exact dissection of contemporary cyberculture's idea of its destiny most of a century in advance. It's a great story on its own terms, but it also puts a finger on the central weakness of an information-centered society. Information does not exist without a physical substrate, and if the physical substrate goes, so does the information. In Forrester's story, that substrate was the machine, an interconnected global technostructure that provided the necessities and luxuries of life to billions of people who spent their lives in hive-like cells, staring into screens and tapping on keyboards for all the world like today's computer geeks. Adept at manipulating abstract ideas, the inhabitants of the machine lost touch with the fact that their universe of information only existed because the physical structure of the machine kept it there. and their attitude toward the machine evolved into a religious reverence, free of any reference to the practical realities of the machine's workings. The skills needed to apply tools to pipes and wires dropped out of use, and the consequences, minor malfunctions snowballing into major ones and finally into total system failure and mass death, followed from there. Now, of course, fiction is fiction, and the events that caused Forster's machine to stop are unlikely to be repeated in the real world. The central concept, though, demands attention, because our machine, the Internet, depends just as much on a physical substrate as the one in Forster's novella. In our case, that substrate is a global network of communications links and server farms, and the even vaster economic and technical infrastructure that keeps them funded, powered, and supplied with the trained personnel and spare parts they need. Very few people realize just how extravagant a supply of resources goes into maintaining the information economy. The energy cost to run a home computer is modest enough that it's rarely noticed, for example, that each one of the big server farms that keep today's social websites up and running uses much electricity as a mid-sized city. Multiply that by tens of thousands of server farms that keep today's online economy going, and the hundreds of other energy-intensive activities that go into maintaining the Internet and manufacturing the equipment it uses, and it may start to become clear how much energy goes into putting pretty pictures and text onto your computer screen. It's not accidental that the Internet came into existence during the last hurrah of the age of cheap energy, the quarter century between 1980 and 2005, when the price of energy hit the lowest levels in human history. Only when energy was quite literally too cheap to bother conserving could so energy-intensive an information network be constructed. The problem with this, as already discussed, is that the conditions that made energy cheap and abundant during that quarter century have already come and gone, and the economics of the Internet take on a very different shape as energy becomes scarce and expensive again. Let's start with the law of supply and demand. As we have seen, this has had its problems when applied to energy and other primary goods, but it works very well when applied to non-essential services such as the Internet. If the cost of maintaining the Internet in its current form outstrips the income that can be generated by it, the Internet becomes a losing proposition, and cheaper modes of information storage and delivery will emerge to replace it. Governments may decide to maintain some form of the Internet as long as they can, even when it becomes an economic sink. But this does not mean that everyone in the industrial world will have the same access they do today. Instead, as energy costs move unsteadily upward and resource needs increasingly get met, or not, on the basis of urgency, we can expect access costs to rise, government regulation to increase, Internet commerce to be subject to increasing taxation, and rural regions and poor neighborhoods to lose Internet service altogether. There may well still be an Internet a quarter century from now, but it will likely cost much more, reach far fewer people, and have only a limited resemblance to the free-for-all that exists today. Newspapers, radio, and television all moved from a growth phase of wild diversity and limited regulation to a mature phase of vast monopolies with tightly controlled content. Even in the absence of energy limits, the Internet would be likely to follow the same trajectory, and the rising costs imposed by the end of cheap energy bid fair to shift that process into overdrive. As the economic burden of the Internet's immense energy usage begins to bear down then, other technologies less dependent on huge energy inputs will become more economical, driving a spiral in which rising costs and restricted access will cut into Internet service while simpler technologies absorb a growing range of its current economic roles. Finally, once economic contraction has gone far enough, the Internet may just simply drop out of use altogether because the economic basis for its operation will have gone away. It's true, of course, that the Internet could be operated more efficiently than it is today. Efforts to increase efficiency, however, are subject to a law of diminishing returns. A range of limits ultimately rooted in thermodynamics put a ceiling on just how efficient any process can get. Such gains also have the costs of their own. Research and development does not come cheap, nor do the construction and installation of more efficient equipment. And the budget cuts currently sweeping through companies and universities worldwide, themselves the harbingers of much greater cuts to come, hardly support the act of faith that claims infinite technological improvement will be the answer to this and all other problems. Nor is it valid to put the possibility of increased efficiency for the Internet on the one side of the balance and ignore the equivalent possibilities on the other side. After all, other technologies, some of which already use less energy than the Internet, are just as liable to see gains in efficiency as the Internet. Even a more efficient Internet is unlikely to be the most economical way to use the sharply constrained energy and resource flows of the future. If another technology or suite of technologies can provide something like the same services at a lower cost, that technology or suite of technologies will outcompete the Internet. Thus, if it costs less, all things considered, to send messages over shortwave radio, order products by mail from a catalog, and get pornography from a local adult bookstore, then the Internet will fall by the wayside, or at best will be propped up for non-economic reasons as long as economic realities make it possible to do so. The entire supply chain that keeps the Internet and its potential competitors running has to be factored into these calculations. It's easy to see the Internet as uniquely efficient if all you take into account is the energy going into your home computer. The gigawatts used by server farms are not the only unnoticed energy that goes into the Internet, though. Putting those gigawatts to work requires an electrical grid spanning most of a continent, backed up by the immense inputs of coal and natural gas that put electricity into the wires, and a network of supply chains that stretches from coal mines to power plants to the oil wells that provide diesel fuel for trains and excavation machines. The server farms draw on a vast array of supporting services and manufacturers, from the overseas mines that produce rare earths for semiconductor doping, through the factories that turn out components to the colleges that turn out trained technicians, and the list goes on. All told, a fair fraction of the world's industrial economy helps support the information age in one way or another. And many of those support functions can't be done at all in a less centralized way or at a lower level of technology. Most of the potential replacements for the Internet don't suffer from that limitation. It's entirely possible to build a shortwave radio by hand, for example, using components that can be built from readily available materials. There are radio amateurs alive today who did precisely that before the pre-war electronics boom made manufactured components cheap and as easily accessible. And a shortwave radio can communicate across continental differences just as effectively as the Internet does. As the cost of concentrated energy becomes a major economic burden, these differences will matter and give a massive economic advantage to less energy-intensive ways of accomplishing things. The Economics of Contraction. To suggest that the Internet will turn out to be not the wave of the future, but a relatively short-lived phenomenon on the crest of the age of cheap, abundant energy, is to risk running headlong into the logic of abundance already discussed. It's essential not to get caught up in thinking of how many advantages the Internet might provide to a post-abundance world, because the advantages conferred by the Internet in no way mean that it must continue to exist. The fact that something provides an advantage does not guarantee that it is economically viable. An example from one of the most famous cases of social collapse is relevant here. On Easter Island, the native culture built a thriving society that got most of its food from deep water fishing, using dugout canoes made from the once plentiful trees on the island. As the population expanded, however, the demand for food expanded as well, requiring more canoes, along with many other things made of wood. Eventually, the result was a deforestation so extreme that all the tree species found on the island went extinct. Without wood for canoes, deep-water food sources were out of reach, and Easter Island's society imploded in a terrible spiral of war, starvation, and cannibalism. It's easy to see that nothing would have offered as great an economic advantage to the people of Easter Island as a permanent source of trees for deep-water fishing canoes. It's just as easy to see that once deforestation had gone far enough, nothing on Earth could have provided them with that advantage. Well before the final crisis arrived, the people of Easter Island, even if they had grasped the nature of the trap that had closed around them, would have faced a terrible choice. Leave the last few big trees standing and starve today, or cut them down to make canoes and starve later on. All the less horrific options had already been foreclosed. Further back in Easter Island's history, when it might still have been possible to work out a scheme to manage timber production sustainably and produce a steady supply of trees for canoes, doing so would have required harsh trade-offs. One additional canoe per year, for example, might have required building or repairing one less house each year. Both the canoe and the house would have yielded significant economic advantages, but it wouldn't have been possible to get both. In a world of limited resources, in other words, it's not enough to insist that a given allocation of resources has economic advantages. You must also show that the same resources would not be better used in some other way or for some other need. This sort of thinking will inevitably be applied to technology in a future of energy and resource constraints, and any attempt to make sense of that future in advance needs to start by embracing that sort of thinking now. One useful way to assess the vulnerability of any current technology in the post-abundance world, in fact, is to note the difference between the direct and indirect energy inputs needed to keep it working and the inputs needed for other, potentially competing technologies that can provide some form of the same goods or services. All other things being equal, a technology that depends on large inputs of energy will be more vulnerable and less economically viable in an age of energy scarcity than a technology that depends on smaller inputs. And the larger the disparity in energy use, the greater the economic difference. In turn, communities, businesses, and nations that choose less vulnerable or more economical options will prosper at the expense of those that do not, leading to a generalization of the more economical technology. It really is that simple. You might think that this sort of economic analysis would be an obvious and uncontroversial part of peak oil planning. Of course, it's nothing of the kind. Most discussion and planning around the subject of energy futures these days pays no more than lip service to economics, if it deals with that dimension at all, and a great many of the plans being circulated these days look very appealing until you do the math and discover that the most basic questions about resource inputs and economic outputs haven't been addressed. Part of this blindness to the economic dimension is hardwired into contemporary culture. It hardly needed the mass exodus into delusion that drove the recent real estate bubble to prove that most people in the industrial world nowadays think that getting something for nothing is a reasonable business plan. We have lived with so much abundance for so long that a great many of us seem to have lost any sense that there are limits we can't borrow or bluster our way around. To a very great extent, indeed, the last 300 years of economic expansion have been driven by a borrowing binge, even more colossal and ultimately more catastrophic than the one that began its implosion in 2008. The difference is that instead of borrowing from banks, we borrowed from the Earth's stockpile of fossil carbon and squandered most of our borrowings on vaster equivalents of the salad shooters and granite countertops that absorbed so much fictitious value during the late boom. By the time nature's collection agencies get through with us, they may have repossessed everything we bought with our borrowings, which is to say nearly everything we've built over the last 3 centuries. This wholesale contraction will pose an additional challenge on the future, because nearly all of our recent technologies displaced older technologies that provided the same services on a more sustainable basis. Here again, the Internet provides a solid example. The collapse of the newspaper industry is one widely discussed example of the Internet's toll on older and more sustainable information media. But another, the death spiral of American public libraries, is likely to have a much wider impact in the decades and centuries to come. Among the most troubling consequences of the current economic crisis are wholesale cuts in state and local government funding for libraries. Some of the proponents of these budget cuts have been caught in public insisting that with the rise of the Internet, nobody actually needs public libraries anymore. Of course, public libraries provide many services the Internet doesn't, and provides them to all those people who can't afford Internet access. The crucial point here, though, is that the public library will still be a viable information technology in a post-petroleum society. When Ben Franklin founded North America's first public library, after all, he did it without benefit of fossil fuels. If public libraries can be kept open during the waves of economic crisis that will punctuate the end of the age of abundance, everyone will likely be the better for it. I am sorry to say that this is probably not the way things will fall out. The current wave of library downsizing is very probably a harbinger of things to come. Pressed between too many demands and too little funding to go around, library systems, like public health departments and a great many other institutions that make community life viable, are far too likely to draw the short straw. Exactly this sort of short-term thinking drove the loss of vast amounts of information and cultural heritage in the collapse of past civilizations. As we move into the penumbra of the deindustrial age, then, it's crucial to start thinking about the options open to us, individually and collectively, with an eye toward their long-term viability and to the hard reality of a world of ecological limits. When today's data centers are crumbling ruins long since stripped of valuable salvage, and all the data once stored there has gone wherever magnetic patterns go when they die, the thinking that led politicians to gut library systems on the assumption that the Internet will take up the slack will look remarkably stupid. Still, the habits of thought instilled by the age of cheap abundant energy are hard to shake off, and from within them such mistakes are hard to avoid. The twilight of the machine. The end of the age of cheap abundant energy thus brings with it an unavoidable reshaping of our most basic ideas about economic development. For the last 3 centuries or so, as already discussed, the effective meaning of this phrase has centered on the replacement of human labor by machines powered by fossil fuel. All the other measures of development, and of course plenty of them have been offered down through the years, either reflect or presuppose that basic economic shift. The replacement of labor with mechanical energy has even come to play a potent role in the popular imagination. From the machine-assisted living of the Jetsons to the darker image of reality itself as a machine-created illusion in The Matrix, the future has come to be defined as a place where people do even less work with their own muscles and minds than they do today. All this is the product of the logic of abundance, the notion, rooted down at the core of industrial society's worldview, that there will always be enough resources to let people have whatever it is that they think they want. Abandon that comfortable but unjustifiable assumption, and the future takes on a very different shape. In a world where everything but human beings will be in short supply, it makes no sense whatsoever to deploy increasingly scarce resources to build, maintain, and power machines to do jobs that human labor can do equally well. An example may be useful here. Let's take Rosie the Riveter, the iconic woman factory worker of Second World War fame, and match her up against one of the computer-guided assembly line robots that have replaced so many workers and production lines in the industrial world. We might as well pit icon against icon and call the robot HAL 9000. Both of them serve the same economic function, we'll assume, riveting parts together on an assembly line. It's a credo of contemporary economics that HAL is more productive than Rosie. But since the term productivity in contemporary economic parlance means labor productivity, or in other words, how much production you can get per worker, any machine is by definition more productive than human labor. In a world of resource constraints, though, this definition of productivity becomes very hard to justify. It may be true that HAL can work long shifts at all hours with only the very occasional break for maintenance. At least this is what the robot salesman will tell you, and Rosie cannot. Still, in a world of resource scarcity, Rosie has a crucial advantage that more than offsets HAL's capacity for night shifts. Her operating requirements are much less energy and technology intensive to meet than HAL's. We can start with the energy source used by each riveter. HAL requires electricity, quite a bit of it, within fairly tight specifications of voltage, amperage, and cycles per second. For her part, Rosie requires food, and though she's been known to take a second helping at the factory cafeteria, her fuel needs are fairly modest compared with those of the machine. Her tolerances for variability in energy sources are also much broader than Hal's. If you have trouble believing this, spend a few minutes paging through an old wartime cookbook. Hal's maintenance requirements are just as exacting. He needs lubricants that meet precise specifications and an assortment of spare parts ranging from zinc bushings to integrated circuits, none of which he can provide for himself. All of them must be manufactured off-site, and some, such as integrated circuits, cannot be made without extremely expensive, complex facilities demanding intricate technological infrastructures of their own. Rosie's maintenance needs, by contrast, involve little more than 8 hours of sleep and a modest additional amount of food. I'll have 2 scoops of Smugglin today, Franny. Thanks. It's been a hard shift. When it's necessary to replace Hal, a huge array of industrial facilities, mines, smelters, chemical plants, chip fabrication plants, and one or usually several factories have to be brought into play to produce Hal 9100. Unlike Hal, Rosie can manufacture her own replacement, and while it will take most of 2 decades before Rosie Jr. is ready to tie her hair up in the bandana and take her place on the assembly line, Rosie's own working life is still longer still, so the replacement cycle is not a problem for her. In a world with nearly 7 billion people on it, now more than that, of course, it's hardly necessary to wait for Rosie herself to reproduce in order to find a new riveter, or 10,000 of them. Finally, what happens if the economy changes so that there's no longer a need for so many riveters, as happened at the end of the Second World War? It might be possible to retool Hal for some other industrial purpose, but for reasons of efficiency, most assembly line robots are designed for a very limited range of operations and get mothballed or go into the scrap heap when the demand for their services goes away. Rosie, on the other hand, is capable of a nearly limitless range of productive economic activities and can head off to some other career when the factory closes down, leaving Hal to sing Daisy Bell to himself on the deserted assembly line. These arguments could be developed at even greater detail and with less whimsy, but I trust the point has been made. Hal's appearance of greater productivity depends on access to a support system of factories and services vastly larger than the one Rosie needs. And his support system, in turn, depends on the availability of cheap, abundant energy and a wide range of specialized resources and supplies that hers does not require. What makes Hal more economical in an age of resource and energy abundance is the low cost of that fossil fuel energy. During an age of resource scarcity, the equation changes completely, because the goods and services that support Rosie can be produced with much simpler technology, and with much less in the way of concentrated energy than the goods and services that support Hal. There's a reason for this, of course. Human beings, along with all other living beings, evolved over millions of years in a world of energy and resource scarcity. Our hominid ancestors, and all their ancestors down through the lineage of evolution, all the way to those first prokaryotic cells back in the dank Archean mists, spent most of their lives confronting the hard logic of Malthus, by which populations rise right up to the limits of carrying capacity. There are some multicellular organisms that have requirements as exacting and purposes as limited as most machines, but there are not many, and our species ranks right up there with rats, crows, and cockroaches among nature's supreme generalists. It's only in the highly atypical conditions of the last 3 centuries, then, that machines are more economical than human laborers. This is why, for example, nobody in the Roman world used Hero of Alexandria's Aleopile, the first known steam engine, as a source of power for industry or transport. Craft traditions in the Roman Empire would certainly have been up to the challenge, and the Aleopile was much discussed at the time as an interesting curiosity. What was lacking was the recognition that the black gooey stuff that seeped from the ground in certain places, or the black flammable stone that we call coal, could have been used in large quantities as fuel for such a machine. Lacking that, in turn, the Aleopile was never more than a curiosity, for the fuel supplies that the Roman world knew about were already committed to existing economic sectors, while human and animal muscle were abundant, familiar, and cheap. As the industrial world winds down, human muscle will again be abundant. Will it be cheap? Almost certainly yes, and that means that real wages for most people in the industrial world will continue their current slide toward third world levels. I wish I could say otherwise, not least because my chances of taking part in that slide are tolerably high. Still, part of what has made the last 3 centuries so atypical is the extent to which ordinary people in the industrial world have been able to rise out of the hand-to-mouth existence typical of most of humanity for most of history, and partake of a degree of comfort and security. That state of affairs could never have been permanent because it was made possible only by using up fantastic amounts of fossil sunlight at a pace so extravagant that the quest to figure out what to do with all that energy has been a major driver of economic change for more than a century now. It's simply our bad luck to live at a time when the bill for all that extravagance is coming due. All this should be fairly straightforward and uncontroversial. It isn't, of course, because the contemporary faith in the superiority of the machine reaches deep into the irrational levels of our collective psyche. When Lewis Mumford titled one of his most significant works, The Myth of the Machine, he was not engaging in hyperbole. The thought that Rosie the Riveter could go head-to-head with HAL 9000 and win is unthinkable to most of us. It's a matter of folk belief throughout industrial society that the machine always wins, or at least that any victory over it is as temporary and fatal as John Henry Pyrrhich's triumph over the steam drill. The machine is our totem, the focus of a great deal of our culture's sense of value and purpose, and most people in the industrial world accord it the same omnipotence that older religions claimed for their gods. The sheer volume of popular culture over the last century or so that fixates on the notion of machines taking over the world and treating humanity the way industrial humanity has so often treated other living things is one indicator of the mythic power machines have come to hold in our collective imagination. It's for this reason, I think, that so many of us simply can't imagine a future in which machines will be less economically viable than human labor. Yet if it costs the equivalent of $5 a day to hire a file clerk and a secretary at post-abundance wage scales, and it costs the equivalent of $10 a day in expensive and unreliable electricity to run a computer to do the same things, those businesses that hope to succeed will hire the file clerk and the secretary, and the computer will be left to gather dust. Now it's true, as fans of computers are quick to point out, that computers will do things that secretaries and file clerks can't. But the reverse is also true. Try asking your computer sometime to go pick up takeout lunch for the office from a place that doesn't deliver. And many of the abilities unique to computers are contrivances rather than necessities. Businesses got along very well without them for thousands of years, remember. The technology that's useful to help a human worker do his job more effectively is not the same as the technology that's needed to replace him or her with a machine. As cheap, abundant energy becomes a thing of the past, replacing workers with machines will no longer be a viable option, but providing workers with tools that will make their labor more productive is quite another matter. The problem here is that very few people are used to thinking in these terms. While every industry in the world once had a vast amount of practical knowledge about the tools and training human workers needed to do their jobs well, nearly all of that knowledge is endangered, if it hasn't already been lost. Consider the slide rule as one example among many. Until the 1970s, it was the engineer's inseparable companion. Every technological advance from the mid-19th century until Apollo 11 landing on the moon was made possible in part by competent manipulation of this simple, flexible, ingenious analog computer by people who knew how to make the most of its strengths and work within its limits. Since it doesn't require a massive and technologically complex support structure to construct, maintain, and operate them, any good cabinet maker can make one, and their proper fuel is a scoop of the same slumgullion that kept Rosie going on her shift, slide rules are likely to be just as useful on the downslope of the industrial age as they were on the way up. If, that is, anybody on Earth still remembers how to use one when we get to that point along the curve of economic contraction. This is where the myth of the machine, the conviction, as irrational these days as it is pervasive, that the best person for any job is always not a person at all but a machine, stops becoming a curious twist of our collective imagination and turns into a trap we ignore at our peril. As peak oil moves closer to center stage in the historical drama of our time and makes the gargantuan technostructure we've built on a foundation of cheap, abundant energy ever more problematic to sustain, the most common response from the centers of power and the masses alike is to call for the development of even more complex, gargantuan, and tightly interconnected machines, pushing the technostructure in the direction of greater risk and greater dysfunction. It's hardly an exaggeration to suggest that if it turned out we were all about to perish en masse from building too many machines, the first reaction of most people in today's industrial cultures would likely be to insist that the answer was to build more machines. Thus, we will doubtless see plenty of shiny new machines built in the years to come, and they will doubtless do their fair share and more to push industrial civilization further down the arc of its decline. As the ancient Greeks knew well, it's the essence of tragedy that the arche, that the particular excellence of a tragic hero, also turns out to be his harmatary, or fatal flaw. Put another way, a civilization that lives by the machine can expect to die by the machine as well. The heretical minority that has learned to mistrust the myth of the machine, however, may well keep in mind that as the age of scarcity dawns, educating people is a far more useful project than building machines, and doing as much as possible to ensure that individuals, families, and communities have the skill and simple tools they need to work productively may just be the most promising response to the future ahead of us. There's nothing really remarkable about that future. It's simply that the unparalleled abundance that our civilization bought by burning through 500 million years of stored sunlight in 3 short centuries has left most people in the industrial world clueless about the basic realities of human life in more ordinary times. It's this cluelessness that underlies so many enthusiastic discussions of a green future full of high technology and relative material abundance. Those discussions also rely on one of the dogmas of the modern religion of progress, that the accumulation of technical knowledge was what gave the industrial world its 3 centuries of unparalleled wealth. Since technical knowledge is still accumulating, the belief goes, we may expect more of the same in the future. Now, in fact, the primary driver that drove the rise of industrial civilization and made possible the lavish lifestyles of the recent past was the recklessness with which the Earth's fossil fuel reserves have been extracted and burnt over the last few centuries. The explosion of technical knowledge was a consequence of that, not a cause. In what we might as well get used to calling the real world, that is, the world as it is when human societies don't have such immense quantities of highly concentrated energy ready at hand, the primary constraints on the production of wealth are the natural limits imposed by the annual yield of energy resources and raw materials from the primary economy. Even after 2 billion years of evolution, photosynthesis only converts less than 1% of the solar energy falling on leaves into chemical energy that can be used for other purposes. And that only when other requirements, water, soil nutrients, and so on, are also on hand. Other than a little extra from wind, running water, sunlight, and other naturally occurring energy sources, that trickle of inner energy from photosynthesis is what a non-industrial society has to work with. That's what fuels the sum total of human and animal muscle that works the fields, digs the mines, wields the tools of every craft, and does everything else that produces wealth. This, in turn, is why most people before the industrial age had so little. The available energy and the other resources that can be extracted and used with that energy are too limited to provide any more. The same limits apply to today's non-industrial nations, though for different reasons. Here the problem is the assortment of colonial and neo-colonial arrangements that drain most of the world's wealth into the coffers of a handful of industrial nations, and leave the rest to tussle over the little that's left. The 5% of the world's population that happens to live in the United States, for example, doesn't get to use roughly a third of the world's resources and industrial production because the rest of the world has no desire to use a fairer share themselves. Rather, our prosperity is maintained at their expense, and until recently, when the current imperial system began coming apart at the seams, any non-industrial country that objected too loudly to that state of affairs could count on having its attitude adjusted by way of a coup d'etat or a color revolution stage-managed by one or more of the powers of the industrial world, if not an old-fashioned invasion of the sort derided by Tom Lair's ballad, Send the Marines. Over the last century or so, a handful of insightful thinkers have tried to explore ways in which the cycle of exploitation and dependency can be broken. Schumacher is perhaps the most important of these. Even though he brought his substantial background as a working economist to bear on the problems facing the world's non-industrial nations, he drew his central ideas from a different source, the largely neglected economic ideas of Gandhi. Most people in the industrial world think of Mohandas K. Gandhi as a spiritual leader, which of course he was, and as a political figure, which he also was. It's not as often remembered that he spent quite a bit of time and effort developing an economic theory appropriate to the challenges facing a newly independent India. His suggestion, to condense some very subtle thinking into just a few words, was that a nation that had a vast labor force but very little money was wasting its time investing that money in state-of-the-art industrial plants. Instead, he suggested, the most effective approach was to equip that vast labor force with tools that would improve their productivity within the existing structure of resource supply, production, and distribution. Instead of replacing India's huge home-based spinning and weaving industry with factories, for example, and throwing millions of spinners and weavers out of work, he argued that the most effective use of India's limited resources was to help those spinners and weavers upgrade their skills, spinning wheels and looms, so that they could produce more cloth at a lower price, continue to support themselves by their labor, and in the process make India self-sufficient in textile production. This sort of thinking flies in the face of nearly every mainstream economic theory since Adam Smith. Since nearly every mainstream economic theory since Adam Smith played a role in landing the industrial world in its current mess, I'm not so sure this is a bad thing. Current economics dismisses Gandhi's ideas on the grounds of their inefficiency, but this has to be taken in context. Efficiency in today's economic jargon means nothing more than efficiency in producing somebody a profit. As a way of keeping millions of people gainfully employed, stabilizing the economy of a poor nation, and preventing its wealth from being siphoned overseas by predatory industrial nations, Gandhi's proposal is arguably very efficient indeed. And this in turn was what brought it to the attention of E.F. Schumacher. One of Schumacher's particular talents was a gift for intellectual synthesis. His work is full of cogent insights that sum up a great deal of more specialized work and make it applicable to a wide range of circumstances. This is what he did with Gandhi's ideas. Schumacher argued that talk about, quote, developing the third world, unquote, typically neglected to deal with one of the most pragmatic issues of all, the cost of setting up workers with the tools they needed to work. An example will help explore his logic. You are the president of the newly independent nation of Imaginaria. You've got a population that's not particularly well fed, clothed, and housed, and a high unemployment rate. You've got a very modest budget for economic development. Your nation, however, has raw materials of various kinds, which could be used to feed, clothe, and house the Imaginarian people. Your foreign economic advisors, who not coincidentally come from the industrial nation that used to be your country's imperial overlord, insist that your best option is to use your budget to build a big modern factory that will turn those raw materials into goods for export to the industrial nation by its own merchants, giving your country cash income to buy goods from them, and in the process employing a few thousand Imaginarians as factory workers. Not so fast, says Schumacher. If your goal is to feed, clothe, house, and employ the Imaginarian people, building a factory is a very inefficient way to go about it, because that approach requires a very large investment per worker employed. You can provide many more Imaginarians with productive jobs for the same amount of money by turning to a technology that's less expensive to build, maintain, and supply with energy and raw materials, say by providing them with hand tools and workbenches instead of state-of-the-art fabrication equipment, and setting up supply chains that supply them with local raw materials instead of imports from abroad. The goods those workers produce may not be suitable for export, but that's not necessarily a problem. Remember, your goal is to feed, clothe, and house Imaginarians so they will re-elect you, and maximizing production for domestic use will make you more popular in the Imaginarian street, since less of the value produced by those workers will be skimmed off by the middlemen who manage in international trade. Furthermore, since your nation won't have to trade with overseas producers for as many of the necessities of life, the need for cash from overseas goes down, and you get an economy less vulnerable to foreign exchange shocks into the bargain. This was the basis for what Schumacher called intermediate technology, and the younger generation of activist inventors who followed in his footsteps called appropriate technology. Their idea was that relatively simple technologies powered by locally available energy sources and drawing on locally available raw materials could provide paying jobs and an improved standard of living for working people throughout the Third World. A lot of productive thinking went into these projects, and there were impressive success stories before the counter-revolution of the 1980s cut what little funding the movement had been able to find. Mind you, Schumacher's thinking was never popular among economists or the business world, and it happened more than once that countries that tried to adopt such economic policies were treated to the sort of attitude adjustments mentioned earlier. Still, pay attention to those third world nations that have succeeded in becoming relatively prosperous, and you'll find that some version of Schumacher's scheme played a significant role in helping them do that. It's when the same logic is applied to the industrial world, though, that Schumacher's ideas become most relevant to the project of this book. As the economies of the industrial world begin to take on features until recently confined to the non-industrial world, thinking designed for the non-industrial world may be a good deal more applicable here and now than the conventional wisdom might suggest. It seems utterly improbable that the governments of today's industrial powers will have the foresight, or for that matter the common sense, to realize that economic policies that deliberately increase the number of people earning a living might be a very good idea in an age of pervasive structural unemployment. Or for that matter to glimpse the unraveling of the industrial age and realize that within a finite amount of time, the choice will no longer be between high-tech and low-tech ways of manufacturing goods, but between low-tech ways and no way at all. Still, national governments are not the only players in the game. What Schumacher proposed, in fact, is one of the missing pieces to the puzzle of sustainability in an age of industrial decline. The economies of scale that made centralized mass production possible in recent decades were simply one more side effect of the vast amounts of energy the industrial nations burnt up during that time. As fossil fuel depletion brings those excesses to an end, the energy and other resources needed to maintain centralized mass production will no longer be available, and what I've described above as the economics of the real world come into play. At that point, the question of how much it costs to equip a worker to do a given job becomes a central economic issue, because any resources that have to go to equipping that worker must be taken away from other productive use. In the twilight of the age of cheap energy, the most abundant energy source remaining throughout the world will be human labor, and as other resources become more costly, the price of labor, and thus the wages that can be earned by it, will drop accordingly. At the same time, human labor has certain crucial advantages in a world of energy scarcity, just as it did in earlier eras of economic contraction and social decline. Unlike other technologies, human labor is fueled by food, which is a form of solar energy. Our agricultural system produces food using fossil fuels, but this is a habit of the age of abundant energy. Field labor by human beings with simple tools, paid at close to third world wages, already plays a crucial role in the production of many crops in the U.S., and this will only increase as wages drop and fuel prices rise. The agriculture of the future, like agriculture in any thickly populated society with few energy resources, will thus use land intensively rather than extensively, rely on human labor with hand tools rather than more energy-intensive methods, and produce bulk vegetable crops and relatively modest amounts of animal protein. the agricultural systems of medieval China and Japan, chronicled by F. H. King in Farmers of 40 Centuries, are as good a model as any. Such an agricultural system will not support 7 billion people, but then neither will anything else, and a decline in population as malnutrition becomes common and public health collapses is a fairly safe bet for the not-too-distant future. For similar reasons, the economies of the future will make use of human labor rather than any of the currently fashionable mechanical or electronic technologies as their principal means for getting things done. Partly this will happen because in an overly crowded world where all of the resources are scarce and costly, human labor will be the cheapest resource available, but it draws on other factors as well. This was pointed out many years ago by Lewis Mumford in The Myth of the Machine. He argued that the revolutionary change that gave rise to the first urban civilizations was not agriculture or literacy or any of the other things most often cited in this context. Instead, he proposed, that change was the invention of the world's first machine, a machine distinguished from all others in that all of its parts were human beings. Call it an army, a labor gang, a bureaucracy, or the first stirrings of a factory system. In these cases and more, it consisted of a group of people able to work together in unison. All later machines, he suggested, were attempts to make inanimate things display the singleness of purpose that a line of harvesters reaping barley or a work gang hauling a stone into place on a pyramid. This kind of machine has huge advantages in a world of abundant population and scarce resources. It is, among other things, a very efficient means of producing the food that fuels it and the other items needed by its component parts. And it is also very efficient at maintaining and reproducing itself. As a means of turning solar energy into productive labor, it is less efficient than current technologies. But its simplicity, its resilience, and its ability to cope with widely varying inputs give it a potent edge over these in a time of turbulence and social decay. This kind of machine, it deserves to be said, is profoundly repellent to many people in the industrial world, doubtless including many of those who are reading this book. It's interesting to think about why this should be so, especially when some examples of the machine at work, Amish barn raisings come to mind, have gained iconic status in the alternative scene. It's not going too far, I think, to point out that the word community, which receives so much lip service these days, is in many ways another word for Mumford's primal machine. For the last few centuries, we have tried replacing that machine with a dizzying assortment of others, instead of subordinating individual desires to collective needs. Like every previous society, we have built a surrogate community of machines powered by coal and oil and natural gas to take care, however sporadically, of our collective needs. As those resources deplete, societies used to directing non-human energy according to scientific principles will face the challenge of learning once again how to direct human energy according to older and less familiar laws. This can be done in relatively humane ways, or in starkly inhumane ones. What remains to be seen is where along the spectrum the societies of the future will fall. Becoming a third world country. Recognizing that the ideas of Schumacher, crafted for the newly independent nations of his own time, are increasingly relevant to the industrial nations of the present, however, is only one part of a broader and even less welcome realization. The recognition that perhaps the best way to describe the changes ahead is to say that most of the world's industrial nations are in the process of becoming third world countries. For all its current power and wealth, the United States is firmly in the lead of that transition. What distinguishes the world's non-industrial countries from the privileged industrial minority of the world's nations? Third world nations import most of their manufactured goods from abroad and export mostly raw materials. That's been true of the United States for decades now. Third world economies have inadequate domestic capital and are dependent upon loans from abroad. That's been true of the United States for just about as long. Third world societies are economically burdened by severe problems with public health. The United States ranks dead last for life expectancy among industrial nations, and its rates of infant mortality are on par with those in Indonesia. So that's covered. Third world nations are very often governed by kleptocracies that run the affairs of government for the private benefit of the few, and a strong case can be made that this, too, is currently the state of affairs in the United States. There are, in fact, precisely two things left that differentiate the United States from any other large, overpopulated, impoverished third world nation. The first is that the average standard of living in the United States, measured either in money or in terms of energy and resource consumption, stands well above third world levels. In fact, it's well above the levels of most other industrial nations. The second is that the United States has the world's most expensive and technologically complex military. Those two factors are closely related, and understanding their relationship is crucial in making sense of the end of the American century and the decline of the United States, along with other industrial nations, to third world status. The U.S. has the world's most expensive military because, just now, it has the world's largest empire. It's not considered polite to talk about American global hegemony in these terms, but the U.S. does not keep its troops garrisoned in 140 countries around the world for the sake of their health. The U.S. empire functions, like other empires, as a way of tilting economic relationships between nations so that wealth flows out of the rest of the world and into the coffers of the imperial nation. It never occurs to most Americans to wonder why it is that 5% of the world's population who live in the U.S. get to use around one-third of the world's industrial products. The economics of empire are the reason why. A century ago, in 1910, Britain had the global empire, the worldwide garrisons, and the torrents of wealth flowing from around the world to boost the British standard of living at the expense of everyone else. A century from now, in 2110, if the technology to maintain a worldwide empire still exists, and it can be done with a much simpler technological basis, Spain managed to build the world empire with no technology more complex than wooden sailing ships and crude cannons. Somebody else will be in that position. It won't be America, because empire is the methamphetamine of nations. In the short term, the effects feel great, but in the long term, they're lethal. Britain managed to walk away from its empire without catastrophe because the United States was willing and able to take over and give Britain a place in the inner circle of U.S. allies into the bargain. Most other nations have paid for their imperial overshoot with a century or two of economic collapse, political chaos, and social disintegration. The economics of empire also explains why it is that so many people in the industrial world believe that it makes sense for them to consume much more in the ways of goods and services than they produce. During much of the industrial era, a good fraction of Europe did get away with consuming more than it produced by the simple expedient of owning most of the rest of the world and exploiting it for their own economic benefit. As late as 1914, the vast majority of the world's land surface was either ruled directly from a European capital, occupied by people of European descent, or dominated by European power through some form of radically unequal treaty relationship. The accelerating drawdown of fossil fuels over the last 3 centuries shifted the process into overdrive, allowing the minority of the Earth's population who lived in Europe, or the more privileged nations of European diaspora, the United States first among them, not only to adopt what were, by all standards of all previous human societies, extravagantly lavish lifestyles, but to expect that those lifestyles would become ever more lavish in the future. I don't think that more than a handful of people in the industrial world have yet begun to deal with the hard fact that those days are over. European domination of the globe, the first source of Euro-American wealth and power, came apart explosively in the 4 brutal decades between 1914, when the First World War broke out, and 1954, when the fall of French Indonesia put a period to the age of European empire. The United States, which inherited what was left of Europe's imperial role, never achieved the level of global dominance that European nations took for granted until 1914. Compare the British Empire, which directly ruled a quarter of the Earth's land surface, with the hole and corner arrangements that allow America to maintain garrisons in other people's countries around the world today, and the difference is hard to miss. Now, the second and arguably more important source of Euro-American wealth and power, the exploitation of 500 million years of prehistoric sunlight in the form of fossil fuels, has peaked and entered its own decline, with consequences that bid fair to be at least as drastic as those that follow the shattering of the Pax Europa in 1914. Thus, the end of the bubble of industrialism is made more complex by the end of the bubble of America's political and economic hegemony over the rest of the planet. Like every other empire, we have a tribute economy. We dress it up in free market clothing by giving our trading partners mountains of worthless paper in return for the torrents of real wealth that flow into the U.S. every day. But the result, now as in the past, is that the imperial nation and its inner circle of allies have a vast surplus of wealth sloshing through their economies. This has had massive social impacts, since handing over a little of that extra wealth to the poor and the working class has proven to be a tolerably effective way to maintain some semblance of social order. This habit has been around nearly as long as empires themselves. The Romans were particularly adept at it. Bread in circuses is the famous phrase for their policy of providing free food and entertainment to the Roman urban poor to keep them docile. Starting in the wake of the last Great Depression, when many wealthy people woke up to the fact that their wealth did not protect them against bombs tossed through windows, most industrial nations have done the same thing by ratcheting up working-class incomes, providing benefits such as old-age pensions, and providing plenty of free entertainment in such forms as broadcast television. What passes by the name of democracy in most industrial nations, as a result, is a system in which factions of the political class buy votes from pressure groups by handing out what the American political slang of an earlier day called by the endearing term pork. An economy capable of expanding the money supply at will provided ample resources for political pork vendors, and the resulting outpouring of pig products formed a rising tide that, as the saying goes, lifted all boats. The problem faced by the United States in this context is the same one that brought repeated economic crises to the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, and many other examples in history. The flood of wealth brought into an imperial economy drives up wages, and when wages in the imperial nation rise far enough above those of its neighbors, it stops being profitable to hire people in that nation for any task that can be done outside it. The result is a society in which those who get access to pork prosper, and those who don't are left twisting in the wind. Arnold Toynbee, whose monumental study of the rise and fall of empires remains the most detailed examination of the process, calls these latter the internal proletariat, those who live within a society but no longer share in its benefits and become increasingly disaffected from its ideals and institutions. In the near term, they are the natural fodder of demagogues. In the longer term, they make common cause with the external proletariat, those peoples outside the borders whose labor and resources have become essential to the economy of a dominant state, but who receive no benefits from that economy, and play a key role in bringing the whole system crashing down. That's the corner into which the United States has backed itself. The flood of lightly disguised tribute from overseas, while it made Americans fantastically wealthy by the standards of the rest of the world, also gutted America's domestic economy and created a culture of entitlement that includes all classes from the bottom of the social pyramid right up to the top. As always happens, sooner or later, the benefits of empire are failing to keep pace with its rising costs. And in addition, rising demands for imperial largesse from all parts of society are drawing down an increasingly straitened supply of wealth. Meanwhile, other nations with imperial ambitions are circling like sharks. The wisest among them know that time is on their side, and that any additional burden that can be loaded onto a drowning empire will hasten the day when it goes under for the third time, and they can close in for the kill. The Twilight of American Empire. This view of the world situation gets little space in the cultural mainstream, or for that matter, in any of the self-proclaimed alternative scenes. The contrast with a century ago is instructive. Many people in late imperial Britain knew well that the empire, on which the sun famously never set — critics suggested that this was because God himself wouldn't trust an Englishman in the dark — had had its day and was itself setting. The lines of Rudyard Kipling's poem, Recessional, simply put in powerful imagery, what many people were thinking at the time. Far called, our navies melt away. On dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. You won't find the same sort of historical sense widespread nowadays, though, and the power of the modern world's secular religion of progress has a great deal to do with it. In 1910, the concept of historical decline was on a great many minds. These days, you'll hardly hear it mentioned, because the belief in history as perpetual progress has become all the more entrenched, as the foundations that made the progress of recent centuries possible have rotted away. The resulting insistence on seeing all social changes through onward and upward colored spectacles has imposed huge distortions on our perceptions of recent events. One good example is the rise and fall of the so-called global economy in recent decades. Its proponents portray it as the triumphal wave of a utopian future that would enable everybody to live like middle-class Americans. Its critics portrayed it as the equally triumphant metastasis of a monolithic corporate power out to enslave the world. Very few people saw it as the desperate gambit of a failing imperial society that could no longer afford to run its own economy and was forced to outsource even its most basic economic functions to the poorer 9/10 of the world. Nonetheless, this last is what it has turned out to be, and several other nations predictably used the influx of capital and technology to build their own industrial sectors, bide their time, and then enter the market themselves and outcompete the very companies and countries that gave them a foot in the door. More broadly, it seems to have escaped the attention of a great many observers that the day of the multinational corporation is drawing to an end. The struggle over Russia's energy resources was the decisive battle there, and when Vladimir Putin crushed the Western-funded oligarchs and turned control of his country's energy supply back to its government, that battle was settled with a typical Russian sense of drama. The elegance with which China has turned international trade law against its putative beneficiaries is just as typical. A flurry of corporations owned by the Chinese government have spread their operations throughout the world, using the mechanisms of global trade to lay the foundations of a future Chinese global empire, while the Chinese government has efficiently stonewalled any further trade negotiations that would have put Chinese economic interests at home in jeopardy. More recently, China has begun buying sizable stakes in the multinational corporations that so many well-meaning people in the West once thought would reduce the world to vassalage. The day when ExxonMobil is a wholly owned subsidiary of China National Offshore Oil Corporation may be closer than it looks. The same biases that make such global changes invisible have impacts at least as sweeping here in North America. Faith in progress, coupled with the tribute economy's culture of entitlement, have made it nearly impossible for anybody in public life to talk about the hard fact that America can no longer afford most of the social habits it adopted during its age of empire. It's impossible to think of an aspect of daily life that will not be changed drastically as a result. We will have to give up the notion, for example, that most people in the industrial world ought to go to college and get a meaningful and fulfilling job of the sort that can be done sitting at a desk. We will have to abandon the idea that it makes any sense to spend $250,000 giving an elderly person with an incurable disease 6 more months of life. We will have to relearn the old distinction between the deserving poor, those who are willing to work and simply need the opportunity, or who have fallen into destitution through circumstances outside their control, and those who are simply trying to game the system. The great majority of us will get to find out what it's like to make things instead of buying them, even when that means a sharp reduction in quality, to skip meals or make do with very little because the money to pay for anything more simply isn't there, and to treat serious illnesses at home because care from a doctor costs too much. I could go on for paragraphs, but I trust you get the idea. All these changes, it needs to be said, would be inevitable at this point, even if the industrial world depended on renewable resources and had a stable, sustainable relationship with the planetary biosphere that supports all of our lives. The United States has played its recent hands in the game of empire very badly, Indeed, and it has responded to each loss by doubling down and raising the stakes even higher. This does not offer much hope for a future of stability. The global context of the crisis, though, also needs to be kept in mind. The industrial world does not depend on renewable resources, and its relationship with the biosphere is leading it straight down the well-worn path of overshoot and collapse. The endgame of American empire, while it would be taking place anyway, has the additional factor of the limits to growth in play. In an alternative world where energy and resource flows could be counted on to remain stable for the foreseeable future, it's quite possible that one of the rising powers might offer America the same devil's bargain that we offered Britain in 1942, and prop up the hulk of our empire just long enough to take it over for themselves. As it is, it cannot have escaped the attention of any other nation that something like a quarter of the world's dwindling resource supplies could be available for other countries if only the United States were to lose the ability to get energy and other resources from outside its own borders. Plenty of nations would profit mightily from such a readjustment, and nothing so unseemly as a global war would necessarily be required to make it happen. To name only one possibility, it's by no means unthinkable that the United States, having manufactured color revolutions, quote-unquote, to order in countries around the world, might turn out to be vulnerable to the same sort of well-organized mob action here at home. Exactly how things will play out in the months and years to come is anybody's guess. One of the consequences of America's descent into third world status, though, is that a great many of us may have scant leisure to contemplate global and national issues amid the struggle to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. In the long run, this shift in focus may have certain advantages. Those nations that undergo the transition soonest and thus forced to learn how to get by on modest energy and resource flows available in the absence of fossil fuels may find that this gives them a head start in making changes that everyone else will have to make in due time. Still, making the most of those advantages will require a different approach to economics, among other things, than most of us have pursued or imagined pursuing so far. Survival isn't cost-effective. Economic factors have played a massive role in putting the industrial world in its current predicament, and play an even more substantial role in blocking any constructive attempt to get out of the corner into which we've painted ourselves. There's all too real a sense in which, if modern industrial civilization perishes, it will be because the steps necessary for its survival weren't cost-effective enough. Mind you, this can be interpreted in at least two different ways: as a statement of economic theory or as a statement of practical experience, and both of them are relevant to the crisis of the industrial world. Like any other science, economics is a set of hypothetical models that reflect, with more or less exactness, the observed behavior of the world. Too often, though, the models get confused with the reality, and understanding suffers. This has to be kept in mind when trying to make sense of the economic dimension of industrial civilization's decline and fall, because both sides of the equation, the models and the reality, throw up challenges in the way of constructive action. So do economic policies that are based on the models, and thus function at a second remove from reality. It's true, of course, that current economic theory has lost touch with reality in critical ways, and a revision of some of the basic ideas of modern economics is essential if we're to make sense of our predicament and do anything constructive in response to it. It's equally true that government policies based on today's misguided economic notions have become massive liabilities to societies struggling to deal with today's crisis. And even this late in the game, changes in these policies might still do a great deal of good. Still, it's also true that economic factors in the real world, independent of theory, impose hard limits on what can be done. This has particular applicability to the current crisis of industrial society. The grim scenario traced out in the seminal 1973 study, The Limits to Growth, still the most plausible map of the future ahead of us, and thus inevitably the most vilified, is driven by simple economics. An industrial economy pursuing limitless growth in a finite world, that study pointed out, will have to contend with a steadily depleting resource base and rising pollution generated by the process of industrial production. As resources deplete, the costs of keeping them flowing into the economy will increase in real terms, as more labor and capital have to be invested to extract a given amount of each resource. As pollution levels rise, in turn, the costs of mitigating their impacts on public health, agricultural productivity, and other core economic factors go up in the same way and for the same reasons. Those costs have to be paid out of the current economic output, leaving less and less for other uses, until economic output itself begins to fall and the industrial world begins its terminal decline. Now, I'm going to read this paragraph again because this is a fabulous, quick summary of the significance of the book, The Limits to Growth. The grim scenario traced out in the seminal 1973 study, The Limits to Growth, still the most plausible map of the future ahead of us, and thus inevitably the most bitterly vilified, is driven by simple economics. An industrial economy pursuing limitless growth in a finite world, that study pointed out, will have to contend with a steadily depleting resource base and rising pollution generated by the process of industrial production. As resources deplete, the cost of keeping them flowing into the economy will increase in real terms, as more capital and labor have to be invested to extract a given amount of each resource. As pollution levels rise, in turn, the costs of mitigating their impacts on public health, agricultural productivity, and other core economic factors go up in the same way and for the same reasons. Those costs have to be paid out of current economic output, leaving less and less for other uses, until economic output itself begins to fall and the industrial world begins its terminal decline. Now, it's easy to insist, if you ignore the economic dimension, that a society facing this sort of crisis can save itself by launching a massive program to build nuclear reactors, solar thermal power plants, algal biodiesel, or what have you. And of course, this sort of claim has seen endless rehashing over the last couple of decades. The problem is that massive programs of this sort pile additional demands on an already faltering economy and resource base. Any such program has to be paid for, after all, and by this I don't mean that money has to be found for it. In today's hallucinatory economic climate, conjuring money out of thin air is easy enough. No, it has to be paid out of current resource stocks and economic output, which are much less flexible and already have to cover the rising costs of resource depletion and pollution. This is the trap hidden in the limits to growth. Once those limits begin to bite, the spare economic capacity that would be needed to build a way out of trouble no longer exists. Nor is it possible to avoid such economic challenges by embracing such options as the lifeboat communities proposed so often in recent years. The basic idea seems plausible enough at first glance. To preserve lives and knowledge through the decline and fall of the industrial civilization by establishing a network of self-sufficient communities in isolated rural areas equipped with the tools and technology they will need to maintain a tolerable standard of living in difficult times. The trouble comes, as it usually does, when it's time to tote up the bill. The average lifeboat community project would cost well over $10 million to establish. Many would cost a great deal more, and I have yet to see such a project that provides any means for its inhabitants to cover those costs and pay their bills in the years before industrial civilization goes away. The unstated assumption seems to be that as soon as the intrepid residents of such a community move into their solar-heated co-housing units, start up the wind turbines and the methane generators, and get to work harvesting tree crops from the permacultured landscape all around, industrial civilization will disappear in a puff of smoke and take its taxes, debts, and miscellaneous expenses with it. Pleasant though the prospect might seem, I'm sorry to say this isn't going to happen. The residents of any lifeboat community founded today will not only have to come up somehow with the very substantial sums needed to buy the land, build the co-housing units, wind turbines, and so on, and plant all that permaculture landscaping, they will also have to earn a living during the long transitional period that leads from the world we inhabit today to the conditions that will pertain at the bottom of the curve of decline. Some awareness of those difficulties may go a long way to explain why, of the great number of lifeboat communities that have been proposed over the last decade or two, the number that have been built can be counted on the fingers of one foot. Thus, there are limits hardwired into our situation by the inflexible realities that surround us, and we have already strayed far enough over those limits that the payback will inevitably be harsh. The alternative path traced by Schumacher's concept of intermediate technology and the many practical applications of that concept devised in the years since his time offer one of the few options for easing the burden of that payback. That path has the further advantage, as already mentioned, that it can be put into practice right now by individuals, families, communities, and working groups of various kinds. It need not wait on any collective action by government or society. Still, there are some collective changes that might also be worth pursuing, even this late in the game, and these will form the theme of this book's final chapter.
That's the end of Chapter 5 of John Michael Greer's 2011 book, The Wealth of Nature. Continue to the final part, Part 6, on YouTube, for Chapter 6 and the afterword.